You know, people ask me all the time how I made this film by myself, and why did I even think about making a film by myself, and how did it work out, and was it easy, was it hard, was it uncomfortable, how'd you deal with the locations, how'd you do your settings, how'd you get it in focus, how'd you deal with exposure, you know, how'd you do your sound, all by yourself? Like, how did that happen? How did you pull that off? People ask me that all the time. But the funny thing is that I don't think people really understand that I really did it all by myself, literally. Like, nobody was there for any shot that I did except for one. I had one shot where I had to lay on the ground on Park Avenue in the middle of New York City, in the middle of Park Avenue. And that's the only time somebody was there, because a friend of mine came just to make sure that I wouldn't get hit by a car. But I think it kind of gets past people that I guess in a way I kind of made a YouTube video. Kind of, sort of. But I wasn't even on YouTube at the time. It has nothing to do with YouTube, but you know, I'm just using that as kind of a comparison because, you know, YouTubers shoot themselves, you know, although big YouTubers have teams. They have people doing sound, they have people helping them getting shot, they have editors. You know, people ask me that too. How did you edit it? Would you just learn how to edit? And yeah, the answer is yeah. I checked which editing software I should get for free. You know, I looked around, I you know, everything that I did, I had to figure out what was going to cost me the least amount of money. And so DaVinci Resolve was free. So I picked DaVinci Resolve, although who knew that DaVinci Resolve was like, you know, organic chemistry. I mean, it was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, is learning how to use it. But I did. And eventually I got the paid version because I needed noise reduction, believe it or not. Yeah, because I wanted a dark kind of film, you know, like I studied on YouTube, I studied directors, I studied films, I devoured all these movies that I just loved the way they looked, and I decided that I wanted a dark, moody kind of film. And so I wanted to shoot everything kind of dark. But I didn't really know how to do that. You know, and I was using my phone, you know, my trusty LG V40. I used the LG V30 for about 2 or 3 shots, but mostly I used the LG V40. And so I shot everything dark, but I got a lot of noise in a lot of the shots. A lot of artifacts, a lot of color problems, stuff like that. But the important thing is that I got every shot. You know, like I didn't miss any shots. I mean, how was I going to miss them? Now, the other thing was, I had the entire thing memorized. You know, it's 2 hours and 7 minutes. Just me. I'm the only person in the movie. There's nobody else in the movie, whoever talks ever, whoever appears, nobody. I'm the only guy. I'm the only person. And so the advantage to that is that I knew that my actor, my talent, had done his homework and was prepared to do everything. So I shot pretty much everything in one take. I would say all the dialogue, I pretty much had it in one take. Because why? Because I had prepared to do a play based on the same story for about 2.5 years. I was in preparation and development. And although I had to abandon that theatrical script, I wrote a new screenplay, but still I had to memorize that. But it was based on the same story, so it was pretty easy for me to memorize it. I didn't ad-lib anything except for one scene in the whole film. And that scene was I was sitting at my parents' cemetery, and I had probably what I thought was the best monologue in the whole film. And I was like really prepared to do this, and it was the most dramatic part of the whole movie. It was like this revelation. It was a big deal. And I did a completely different monologue that just came to mind when I was sitting there, because in fact, this is what I wished I was able to say to my parents when they were alive, but I never did, never had a chance to do it. So that I ad-libbed, and you know, when I finished, when I kind of lost my shit and went back and looked at it, I was like, I gotta redo it. I gotta do what I wrote, you know. But then I watched it back and I was like, it's perfect. I can't change that. I'm gonna leave it. And so I had to learn how to shoot myself. And you know, I was talking to somebody this morning about how as you do this over and over and over again, and now I'm talking about my phone, you know, the more I used that phone, the more I knew that I would turn it around, face it towards myself, and I knew exactly what it was going to look like every single time. Like at the beginning, my framing was terrible. Everything, every shot I shot, everything I shot for the first 3 months, I absolutely hated. I hated it. You know, I was like, I can't do this. I suck. You know, I'm not thinking like a filmmaker. I don't know what I'm doing. This looks like just a performance video. It's like, and I had already kind of done that with a play. Before that, I have a play called Brooklyn Quartet, and I created a 4-part miniseries, which I was hoping to make like an HBO-style miniseries, but it really came out like a performance video, and that was it. And it's great, I'm really proud of it, but it wasn't really what I was trying to do. And so for the Center of Distance, I wanted to make a movie. And so I hated everything that I did for the first 3 months, but as I kept doing it, I kept watching videos, you know, I was like studying directors, studying cinematographers, great films. And eventually I started to figure it out, and I finally got one really great shot. I got one great shot, and I was like, I get it. And so after a while, when I turned that phone around, I knew exactly what it was going to look like every single time before I even looked back at it. You know, while I was doing the performance, while I was acting, I knew what was happening behind the camera. And eventually that phone just became a camera to me. Like I no longer looked at it as a phone. It was the tool that I was using to make this work, to make this art. And so I knew exactly what it was going to look like. I learned about exposure, I learned about ISO, I learned about my white balance, everything. I finally learned all this stuff, and I started to apply it, and eventually I knew what it was going to look like. You know, and then, you know, actually there were great advantages to using my phone, because I could put it at certain angles and in certain places where you couldn't fit a camera. You know, maybe you could fit a GoPro or something like that, but even a GoPro, you know, like a phone is just a flat thing. I could stick it in between walls, you know, in the city. In New York City, it was a big deal. I used to hide it under people's tires, you know, park cars. I'd put it on windowsills. I'd put it up in trees. I put it on the back of a bus once. I was at a bus stop and I wanted a shot with some movement. And so I put it on the back of the bus, and when the bus started to move, I started to run after the bus, and I got the shot, and I just barely got my phone before the bus was gone. I did stuff like that. You know, I wanted to get a shot around a corner. Same thing, I put it on the back of a bus, and I followed the bus. I mean, I learned a lot, you know, and I'm sure that what I did was really not that unusual compared to what a lot of great cinematographers do, and a lot of great directors. Like, I'm sure that there are some amazing stories about how people got the shot. But I know for myself, I could write a book on how I made the Center of Distance. But I just, again, I think it gets past people that I did it all by myself. There was nobody around because it was the pandemic. You know, that was the other thing. I was really, really grateful to have been able to document this COVID-19, this pandemic, this time where we were shut down, this scary, unknown thing that happened to us that shut our lives down. I was able to do something productive with that time, but it was a very eerie experience. You know, being in New York City during the pandemic and being where I was up in the Bronx. You know, I lived in the Bronx and I lived down the block from Montefiore Hospital, and all I heard was sirens 24 hours a day, like for months, just sirens and sirens. It's not like that sound. You know, I'm still kind of traumatized from that, you know. I lived down the street from one of those ice trucks where they were putting people who had passed because the morgue was full. That was traumatizing for me and for everybody in our neighborhood. I had nurses who lived in my building. I came home one night, there was a woman sitting on the front stoop of my building. I had this big courtyard and this stoop leading up to the front door, and this girl was sitting there and she was sobbing. So I couldn't walk past her, so I sat down next to her, and then I said, "Are you all right? Like, do you need anything?" And she told me she was a nurse. She'd been a nurse for 23 years, and she said she saw more people die in the first month of COVID than in her entire 23 years of being a nurse in New York City. So, and that was while I was shooting the film, you know, like so many things happened that I remember that will always make it the most amazing, cathartic time for me. Not to mention the subject matter of the film, which was exploring this moment in my life where my biological mother's family connected with me, and I learned her story. And it was a story that I couldn't even have made up. It was just so crazy and so bizarre. And I was able to make this film, this meaningful piece of work, all by myself. You know, like, I actually think that was the best way for me to learn. And so after I finished the film, all by myself, edited it all by myself, you know, again, also I had to learn how to use lights, I had to do the sound by myself. I actually used an LG V20 for the sound. I bought a purple Panda lavalier mic, which cost me, I think, like 45 bucks. I had an old LG V20 because I was obviously an LG fanboy, but LG phones record 24-bit professional audio, 24, 48 kilohertz, like that's pro audio. So the sound, I knew that the sound had to be professional. And I came from the music business. I was a musician, a singer, I played a bunch of instruments, and a producer, and I knew about pro audio. I was actually a beta tester for some music programs, you know. I used Cakewalk, Logic Pro, Sonar, Cubase, I used everything. Like, I knew audio. And so I knew if nothing else in this film was going to be good, the audio was going to be on point, and the music was going to be dope. I knew that. And so, but I had to learn how to sync the audio. I didn't know, you know, I'd never done that before. I didn't know how to do that. At first I was just doing it by kind of eyeballing it, you know. But then I finally realized, like, duh, do that, you know. So I figured it out. So anyway, I finished this film. It became a gigantic project. You know, it went from something just to do to keep me from being incredibly depressed after my play, a play opening that I had, like I said, developed for over 2 years, got canceled. It was going to be the biggest moment of my creative life. Everything that I had worked for, I personally was putting it to this moment. Like, this moment was going to get me to Broadway. That's the way I was looking at it, this play. Because I came close to bringing a play to Broadway. This was going to Broadway. This was going to go to the Public Theater and then Broadway. That was like, no matter what, that's what was going to happen. And it got canceled. And so I started doing this film just to really keep myself from, like, jumping off the George Washington Bridge. I mean, I was dark. And so I had this amazing experience, you know. I could never really describe the spiritual nature of this experience. But I finished, and then I decided, you know what? Remember when we were getting those, you know, pandemic assistance checks? Like, I think we got 2 of them for 1,200 bucks or something like that. I took my first check and I bought a Sony A6400 on eBay. And man, when I got that camera, I realized, wow, you have no idea what you're doing. I mean, it took me, I mean, this is embarrassing to say, but it took me an hour to figure out how to get the lens on properly. Like, I could, you know, and I was so careful with it. I was afraid I was going to break something because I am not the most, you know, fix-it kind of guy. Like, I know how to call the super. I don't really know how to do anything like that. And man, when I started to get into that camera, I was like, wow. You know, first thing I realized is I know what these settings are from my phone because my LG phone had all the manual settings. So I knew how to mess with the ISO. I knew how to mess with the white balance. You know, I knew how to mess with the exposure, everything, you know. I knew the 180 rule, you know, I started to learn about aperture. You know, I bought a Sony 35mm f1.8 OSS lens. That was my first lens. And when I first got it, I was like, this thing is broken. Because it was set at 1.8 and everything looked all messed up, you know. I was like, this lens is messed up. I got to return it. I called the guy I bought it from, also on eBay, and he laughed at me and he explained it to me. He was actually very kind, and he took some time with me and kind of explained it to me. And once I understood it, then I started to study directors' lens usage, you know, lens choices, aperture choices, you know, blurry background, bokeh as everybody calls it. And it became a very kind of spiritual thing for me, like, oh wow, focal lengths, you know, focal lengths emit certain emotions, you know, like wide angle lenses, you know, create this distortion that make things look kind of funny or scary or just not normal. And then, you know, 35mm is normal, the way the world looks at most, you know, the way we see most of the world. 50mm, you know, nifty 50. Why do they call it that? Because it's the most common focal length that most photographers and videographers use, which is what I'm using right now. Now it's funny because this 50mm is equivalent to the 35mm that I was using on my Sony camera, which I still have. Because, you know, it's a crop sensor camera, APS-C, 1.5 times crop, so 35mm is really 52mm. So this 50mm lens is pretty much equivalent to what I was used to when I first got that camera. Now, I bought a bunch of lenses for that camera, and I also had 2 old vintage lenses of my father's that I adapted to that camera. And then I started to get into manual usage of, well, first, you know, that's not true. That's not true, because the truth is, when I shot the film, I did everything manually. Because even though my phone had amazing autofocus, I didn't use it. Because if I saw any pulsing at all or any kind of hunting, it just drove me crazy. So I did everything in manual focus, and so I had to really think about it in advance, how I wanted to use the manual focus shooting myself. Because obviously I couldn't focus pull, you know, watching myself run around. I had to figure out running into the focus, running out of the focus, you know, certain aperture to get everything in focus, or, you know, opening it up wide to get that blurry background and just focus on my face for like maybe a really intense monologue. And with the phone, it was really just about getting the phone closer to me. And the LG phone is like the equivalent of a 27mm lens, I believe. So I shot the whole movie with 1 focal length. And I bought an ND filter so I could stay at 24 frames per second. And so yeah, when I got that Sony camera and I dove deep into that, it was like, my life just continued to change. And so here's the weird thing that happened. The weird thing is that I have been doing nothing but theater, solo theater for 13 years in a row. Before the pandemic came, 13 years I performed 350 days a year, definitely. Whether it be a big theater, a small theater, a poetry club, on the street, I performed in front of people at least 350 days a year for 13 years, no doubt. And you know, anybody who knows me will tell you, Rokkor was out there every day somewhere, every single day, maybe more than 350 days a year, but I'm just thinking like, you know, I had to, you know, maybe get stuck because it was snowing or something, but at least 350 days a year. I'm making another film now. That's why I bought the Panasonic S5. I needed a second camera. I needed a camera with some capabilities that the Sony a6400 doesn't have, although I definitely could have shot this whole film with the Sony, obviously. I mean, I just shot a film with my phone. But now I have 2 cameras. And this camera that I'm talking into right now, the Lumix 5, the S5, is an incredible camera. And it gives me a little bit more capability. And so I'm like, I'm all the way in, you know, like I'm so kind of taken by this craft. It's become a big part of, it's become my whole life. And so I'm thinking like, what's happening? Am I starting over again? Because who am I? Nobody knows who I am. I have like, you know, I don't even have 300 subscribers to this channel. Nobody knows me. I've never done this, but you know, I just made a film on my phone. It's an award-winning film now, and that's kind of cool. But you know, it's like, am I starting my whole life over again? I think I am. And I think I'm all the way in. I think there's no turning back. And I think I'm grateful for that. And I think that if there's one thing the pandemic showed me, it was that I am an artist. I am, if nothing else, I am an artist. It's all I know how to do. And I know how to do it well. And my light went off. So I turn on a different light. So anyway, that must be a sign to end this. So yeah, I'm starting over again. Thanks for watching. And I just wanted to share that with you. I'll see you on the next video. What are you doing? What are you doing with your life now? It's almost New Year's. Are you making resolutions? Are you trying to figure out what's ahead for you? Like, what are you doing? I'm kind of curious. I know what I'm doing. And it's pretty ambitious. See what happens. Yeah.